Odd Conduit Media.
The Sandman Unlocked.
For a moment, Roderick Burgess is scared. He thinks of the effrontery of his action, to capture death, to bind the Reaper. For a moment, he hesitates, but only for a moment.
Hello, dreamers, and welcome to another episode of The Sandman
Unlocked.
I'm one of your co-hosts, Ben Childers, and I'm thrilled you're joining us for our breakdown of The Sandman Issue 1, Sleep of the Just. And I'm joined by my two illustrious co-hosts, Ashley Mowers.
Hi.
And Sean Dotson.
Hi, Ben. Hi, Ashley.
On each episode, we'll be deconstructing the issue in 6 separate sections. First will be the rundown, where we let you know who created the issue.
Next, the catch-up, to be sure you know where we are in the story. And then the breakdown. This gives you a synopsis of that week's issue.
Our next section is the deep dive, when we really get into everything that happened. In our penultimate section, the panel, we'll talk about our favorite panel of the issue. And finally, we'll discuss the best non-Morpheus character.
So there you have it. Ashley, over to you for the rundown.
Thanks, Ben. So, okay. Issue 1, Sleep of the Just. This is who we got on our team. Story, obviously, by Neil Gaiman. The penciling is done by Sam Keith. Inker was Mike Dringenberg. Colorist, Daniel Vozo. Letterer, Todd Klein. Cover art and interior illustrations were done by Dave McKean, who we'll see the work of throughout. Assistant editor, Art Young, and the editor, Karen Berger. Sean, give us the catch-up.
Well, this one's pretty easy. There's nothing. We got a brand spanking new series with creators no one's ever heard of. I guess, at most, a reader might be familiar with, some of the other Sandmen that came before. It's not the very first Sandman series, so maybe you saw the sort of noir mystery man with the gas mask, or maybe the red and gold superhero Sandman from the 70s, but this is definitely something different and something new. Then, let's do the breakdown.
Thanks, Sean. So where we are right now in the story, as Sean said, it's issue 1. And so what we're doing is we're getting the catalyst for what is going to be happening here in Preludes and Nocturnes, which is the first volume of the Sandman. And so what we have is we have the capturing of the Sandman by Roderick Burgess, who is a warlock sorcerer figure in the late 1800s in England. And what he wants to do is he wants to imprison death, so that way he can live forever, and so everyone can live forever. But instead of getting death, he gets dream. And so what we see over the course of this issue is that Dream is going to be stuck in a prison for about 80 years and will be continually tempted by humans to just do something for them to get out of his imprisonment. And what we're going to see in this issue is that the ultimate superpower that the Sandman has is patience. And what he's going to do is he's just going to wait. And he's going to wait. And he's going to wait. And people are going to die. And people are going to die. And eventually, we're going to get to Roderick's son. And a mistake is made. The Sandman is able to get out of his prison. And what he now needs to do is collect his items. He has a ruby, he has a sand pouch, and he has a helmet. And he needs to go out and he find those things. And that is what the first volume is going to be covering. And that's the breakdown. So let's get into it and jump into the deep dive. Ashley, what's the first thing you'd like to talk about?
Okay, so I might have picked one of the nerdiest, very niche me things to be hyper fixated on while I was preparing for this episode. I kind of want to talk about the Magdalene Grimoire. It's spelled like Magdalene, but for for those people who aren't familiar with the UK education system, Magdalen College in Oxford and a couple other colleges that are spelled Magdalene are really Maudlin. It's a whole French thing. There's a charter on the name, et cetera, et cetera. So when you see
I
it...
almost used that as the quote.
Did you really?
But I was nervous that I didn't know how to pronounce it. So I found a different quote.
I've got your back.
And I made Sean say it.
Yeah, I've got your back. So if you're first coming across these comics, you see it makes total sense for you to want to pronounce it as you familiarized yourself with it, Magdalene Grimore, but it's Magdalene Grimore. And this is the book that, as Ben had mentioned, Dr. John Hathaway, curator of the Royal Museum, takes and uses to barter for his son's life with Roderick Burgess for his son's life. And you get the sense that his son died in the process or the course of World War I. You see this book referenced in so many other books and so many other media.
Really?
Yeah. It's funny because even like in a quick Google, it was like, oh, do you mean this? And it gave me all these search results for all these different shows, all these different comics. So it comes up quite a bit. It's also referred to as, and this is some dog Latin or cod Latin, if you excuse the phrase, Liber Fulvarium Paginarum, which means, if you take the Latin, it means the Book of Yellow Pages, which is an inside joke between him and Terry Pratchett. It's basically the telephone book for demons. That's their big joke in Good Omens. Terry Pratchett refers to it as the Necrotelecomenon in his Discworld series. It's also mentioned in Lock and Key when they do the crossover with the Sandman. Kevin Smith brings it up in Green Arrow Volume 3, Issue 9, back in 2001, when he does an issue featuring Stanley Dover, who comes up later. It's mentioned in a Justice League episode when they have like a Adventures in Babysitting episode. It's a whole thing. It's also mentioned in Buffy when Spike is a ghost for a bit. Fred checks it out of the library to try to help him.
Of course it's in Buffy.
Yeah, exactly. I was just like, oh, this is perfect. I love this. So this is one of those sort of pop culture items that comes up frequently.
It's like the Alan Smythe of fictional, occult knowledge, right?
Right, exactly. Well, and then for me, in my own nerdy background, I was really curious to see what this could possibly be based off of. And throughout history, there are tons of just bogus occult grimoires and such that go through that have been like produced and published by who are functionally snake oil salesmen before we had snake oil salesmen. People trying to get other people's hopes up for being able to cheat death or win over, someone in a bout of unrequited love or, one spell I came across was trying to get people to dance naked for you. So it's just ridiculous stuff. Just absolutely.
Money does that.
Yeah.
Money does that.
Yeah. So it's just bogus. But the one that I found that was the closest to what the text being the issue that we're discussing, references that you see Burgess sort of talk about, is this book called The Grand Grimoire. This book really is two books. The first book tells you, quote, and I'm saying tells you in quotes, like heavy quotes, how to summon demons and construct tools to do their bidding. The second book explains how to make pacts, bind demons without the tools if you don't have the first book, and gives you various spells. And the book also describes, and I find this hilarious, the political landscape of hell. As you see in the comics as we get through them, you've got Lucifer, classic, he's the emperor. You've got the princes, you've got the Grand Duke. Did you know that hell has a prime minister?
I would just
Is it
assume
Boris
the
Johnson?
Political landscape of hell looked a lot like ours. I just figured it's probably pretty similar. Yeah.
It's hilarious to me. And there you've got like Brigadier Major. It goes like all the way down to like Inspector General. I find this so funny that they like just the human imagination was like, you know what hell needs? Structure. And they have diagrams for all of them too, as to like what they look like. Dr. Owen Davies from the University of Hertfordshire actually suggests, even though the book claims to be dated back all the way to 1422, that it was actually published in 1702. So again, you've got, bogus publication dates. You've got somebody named Antonia Venetana del Rabina who claims that the text was actually taken from texts composed by King Solomon himself. Not true. I can tell just up front, there's a lot of reasons why that's not true. Primarily because there are some prayers in the book that suggest that King Solomon would be praying to Jehovah, but Jehovah is a Latinization of the Hebrew Yahweh, and they wouldn't be praying, Israelites would not be praying in Latin. Just a heads up. If you're ever wondering, hey, is this a real occult book? Especially if it's claiming to be of Israelite origin, no. They wouldn't
You're
be
just
praying in
perusing
Latin.
your local library.
Yeah, if you're
and
like
you come
going,
across a Book of the Damned.
Yeah, if you're like, I've got
And you're
some
like, wait a second. This isn't Greek. But they're talking about the Israelis.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense.
If you've got some free time in your day and you're like, I'm bored and kind of lonely, still getting out of the pandemic, I could use a friend, let's dredge up a demon. This is just not, this is not on. This is not going to happen. So, yeah, I have a whole list of reasons why the book is absolute. I said I would be more delicate on this podcast. It is malarkey. I won't use the word that I have written down. But it is very funny to read. So you can find on archives, you can find scans of the pages. It's interesting historically, but a lot of these grimoires, if you look at them, it's obvious for their time. There are clear racist depictions of Jews in them because there's ignorant cultural references that they clearly didn't have any context for and didn't bother to look into. Because again, these people were charlatans, the people who were writing them. So they weren't going to be putting a lot of painstaking research into it. They were just trying to write what they thought would sound fun. And would be, would grip people to buy it. But, if you're ever curious, there's a spell to enchant firearms. Again, not getting a big idea that King Solomon was a gun guy. Just a thought. And there's also a really hilarious spell to try to attract the one that you love, where they suggest that you peel a piece of flesh off of a newborn foal, which I don't get a big sense would attract many people on stench alone. But
that's not really a turn on for most.
Yeah, I didn't think so either. But I was like, hey, different times. I don't want to approach this with a modern lens, so who knows? But just the whole concept of grimoires being passed down, it makes sense for narrative purposes. Neil Gaiman would be like, yeah, I know these were their thing. What if one of them were real? Totally makes sense that you would pull this for narrative purposes. But if anyone's just like, I wonder if, no, just don't. Like for historical purposes, yes, fascinating. For actual, spellbinding and demon conjuring, not a thing. So don't do it.
One of my favorite sort of tropes from fantasy and horror and things like that is really that making up some book of forbidden knowledge and then like listing it mixed in with things that do exist or sort of exist. Mm-hmm. Like that, it's like Jorge Luis Borges does that. H.P. Lovecraft did that. So like Neil Gaiman's really fitting into this really cool tradition that was so exciting to me as like a kid reading these things. Cause I'd try to go like, track them down.
Oh,
and,
totally.
Go to the library and be like, do you have any books on demonology?
Right. No, exactly. I remember being like obsessed with demons. I went through, or not demons, but I went through a whole like raven phase. So anytime I saw a crow or a raven, I was like, oh, they're coming. And my mom was like, stop being weird. So like, I think all kids...
You're just like waiting for Odin for showing up.
Right, exactly. Even my dad's like,
the
these
storm
things
crow's
are
here.
It's like, these things aren't real, right? I'm like, yeah, but what if?
What if?
So, yeah. So, now having been further educated, you look at it, you go, oh, this is bunk. But it's fun. It's funny.
Absolutely.
Do you fondly remember blowing the dust out of a golden Nintendo cartridge to get it to work?
Get the dust out of it.
All right, here we go. Yes, let's get it.
Now the screen's gray.
Aw, man. Or those long nights when you were up late fighting Ganon and you'd hear your mom coming downstairs.
Hello? That's Mom. Pretend you're asleep.
Wait, pause it. Turn off the TV.
Do you think she's gone?
Make a sound.
I thought I heard two boys down here. Oh well.
Well, Ben and Pat are here to transport you back to those exhilarating moments as the Hyrule Podcasters! Join the two brothers each week as they play through Zelda games in Nintendo's legendary series. Episodes are filled with color commentary, lightly researched facts, personal anecdotes, and more. Hyrule Podcasters is available through Anchor on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow the Hyrule Podcasters on Facebook and Instagram at Hyrule Podcasters and on Twitter at Hyrule Podcaster.
Sean, what about you? What's one thing you wanted to pull out?
Yeah, sure. I also did want to say, though, on Ashley's point, the actual spell that, I give you a feather taken from an angel, that whole thing that Burgess uses in his attempt to capture death, mistakenly, binds a tired and weakened dream, right? That spell was just completely made up by Neil Gaiman, but he found the sort of rhythm of it in this kind of creepy poem he remembered. So the words are all his, but the sort of flow comes from this poem that he thought sounded spell-like. So what I'd like to talk about here is that right off the bat, Gaiman displays this deep knowledge of and affection for the conventions of genre, right? That's sort of what this story is. But he's also aware that tools like genre can also be a sort of trap. And this ends up as a major theme of the Preludes and Nocturnes arc. My thinking is he's interested in playing with these generic conventions, but also in interrogating them, testing their limits, even overturning them entirely. And this becomes really obvious as the series goes on, but it's there from the very first issue. So Neil has said that the tone of the first issue was intended to be that of the classical English horror story. And he most notably cited Dennis Wheatley as the inspiration here. Dennis Wheatley was this prolific and extremely popular British author in the mid-20th century, who I've seen described as servant of the Queen and enemy of the devil. He was a military man, a strict moralist. He worked for Churchill during the war, and he was, all in all, a serious snob who could tell a hell of a story, usually involving Satanists, sex, and car chases.
Classic.
Yeah, right? His stories were about the forces of chaos versus the forces of order, very Manichean. One journalist says, quote, "In the world of Dennis Wheatley, nowhere outside these shores really exists." Talking about the British Isles. "Foreigners should remain foreigners. If they intrude at all into our green little sphere, they tend to do so as villains, as moral degenerates, as the instigators of dark and terrible religions." Doesn't sound much like Neil Gaiman, does it? But that's one of the really cool things about this issue and the series overall. The Sandman is perfectly happy to take this basic narrative structure and turn it completely inside out. So you've still got the secret cults, the dark and mysterious foreigner, the criminality, the adventure, and the magic. But in Gaiman's telling, it's the homegrown British aristocrats, like Roderick Burgess, who are the villains, and the occult invader from another world, who's the victim and hero. So as Dream says, when he finally escapes and goes to confront Alex Burgess, "You barred me from my realm with your foolish circle. You threatened, cajoled, and pleaded for gifts that are neither mankind's to receive nor mine to give. You had no thought for the harm you must have brought to your world. Lord, what fools these mortals be." First of many Shakespeare references. In Highbender's Sandman Companion, by the way, really instrumental to the research I'm doing for the show. Really well-written book, not in print, kind of expensive, but if you're interested, track it down. Anyway, in a standard epic quest, the hero starts out in ordinary surroundings and then experiences some kind of shock that sends him into a shadow realm where he does battle with primal forces. In the Sandman's case, however, his ordinary surroundings are the shadow realm because he's the personification of myths and dreams. Therefore, the shock he experiences is being dragged from his realm of mystery and nightmare to some penny-ante magician's basement, and instead of doing battle with epic forces, he remains a still and silent prisoner in that basement for 72 years. So we see this reversal of the English horror story, this inversion of the hero's quest, but ultimately, I don't think Neil's just showing off here, although he does often show off, right? I think Gaiman is interested in exploring the concept of empathy and this almost magical ability fiction stories have to produce empathy in readers and in the world. I've seen Neil quote this great Ogden Nash line. Ogden Nash is a poet, where he says, "Where there's a monster, there's a miracle." And that's sort of what I think this first issue shows us, and it gives us an important perspective on the series as a whole.
That's incredible. Yeah, I have almost no familiarity with the British horror genre and those tropes that exist in it. And I think most readers are probably also, they might be familiar with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, maybe? Is that in the same genre, the same literary genre as what you were referencing?
Yeah, I think Frankenstein would have come, a lot earlier, mid-19th century rather than mid-20th century. And, many people point to that as one of the, if not the first science fiction novel. But yes, it's also got that sort of tragic, mysterious figure, right? But I suppose the difference between that and Wheatley's books is that Wheatley's books definitely made a ton of money, and they were definitely lurid, and they were meant to sort of inflame those passions. And I think Wheatley was probably a little more xenophobic. So yeah, potentially Gaiman is thinking both inverting these tropes of the popular fiction from when he was growing up that he enjoyed, but also really wanted to poke at. And in doing so, sort of also bringing in this much wider range of literary influences that do point to finding sort of empathy in these monstrous figures, right?
Thanks, Sean. That was really, really interesting. Ashley, what was your second thing you wanted to chat about?
Yeah, the other thing that I was really curious about in this first issue was just when they reference this sleeping sickness that people are succumbing to, whether that was a real thing or not. And actually, pushing my glasses up my nose, there was a pandemic of encephalitis lethargica in that period through 1915 to 1926. It was a whole big deal. It was a big mystery. It started in Vienna and then rapidly spread wildfire throughout the entire world. So all the people that they're hitting and the way that they're describing their symptoms is reflective of this actual real life pandemic that happened. And I was like, oh, timely. Love reading about another pandemic. It's so great. But it's just really fascinating, some of the symptoms that people experience. Like I said, people thought it was a new illness, and the way that they were sort of describing the disease itself, it wasn't until Konstantin von Economo was describing this unique pattern that he recognized in deceased patients. The disease come up under other names: botulism, an epidemic stupor, hysteroepilepsy, acute dementia, and then in some medical records, it was just described as an obscure disease with cerebral symptoms.
Very helpful.
Yeah, exactly.
Very helpful.
Exactly. They were really trying to figure it out, but it was spreading so quickly, and people were just succumbing to this sleeping sickness that they didn't know what to do. So it sounds a little familiar. It also coincided with an influenza pandemic that hit in 1918. And so it's possible, they theorize, that the influenza virus potentiated the aspects or the symptoms of the encephalitis pandemic that had hit. But also, interestingly, a lot of surviving patients of this pandemic made a complete recovery. Like, there were people that had died, but most of them returned to normal lives. So it's like it hit, and then suddenly they just were fine again and woke up and were cool. So sometimes they would wake up really quickly. Sometimes the sleeping sickness would hit them very rapidly. Sometimes people would wake up disabled, confined to a wheelchair. Some did die in their sleep. Notable cases, really the one that stuck out to me the most was there is a speculation that Hitler had this for a bit. So who's to say? Possibly. When he was a young adult, they suggest that possibly this was the case, and also would make a more substantial case for Parkinsonism later. It's also referenced in various books throughout that time period as this sort of like mysterious, mystical disease that happened. So Neil Gaiman's definitely pulling on something that captured not only the medical imagination, but just like the narrative imagination as well. So the fact that he's pulling from this very real historical event, that's one of the reasons I absolutely love his work, is because he takes the real and he makes it fantastic. He just highlights it a bit more and brings almost more truth to it than the reality offered. Just a fascinating little tidbit. Meditate on that, I guess, if you're really fascinated with pandemics.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing how Gaiman is able to tie these disparate threads together with reality, with the story he's trying to tell, and also the fact that he's like writing into a comic book world, right? That pre-exists this.
Yeah.
So his thinking was he's creating this new Sandman character, this incredibly powerful, immortal, cosmic, near omnipotent being, right? But he's writing it into this world of DC comic superheroes. And he sort of has to ask himself the question of, why does no one know this guy exists previous to this? They've been telling these stories for 60 years. Why isn't he involved in anything? And his answer was, well, he's been imprisoned throughout the entire...
so interesting. I didn't put that together. Mm-hmm. That is such a good idea. That's so cool.
Yeah, so it fits with this historical event and with the, continuity of the storytelling universe he's trying to write into. It fits the sort of early 20th century, like Aleister Crowley sort of mysticism kind of thing, and just works so well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that's the deep dive. So the next thing we're going to do is we've each selected our favorite panel, but what I thought would be good is to have Sean define for us, what is a panel? Because there's a panel, there's a page, there's a bunch of different words used to describe what you have in a comic. And I think it'd be nice to say, what is a panel?
Okay, sure, yes. So Scott McCloud, who is a comic book creator and sort of theorist on the medium, famously described comic book panels as boxes of time. Right? The fundamental unit of the comics medium is the page, and the story told in that page, that each singular event is divided into one of those little boxes that we call a panel. So if you haven't read many comic books before, I've heard some people come up to me and say, yeah, I want to try these out, but I don't really know how to read them. Well, you generally read them in the same way that you would anything else in the English language, left to right, top to bottom. Each one is highlighting a certain moment that the storyteller wishes to show you and act as a bridge between that moment and the rest of the story.
And my comic book knowledge is limited, but it felt like when I was reading The Sandman that he was almost pushing to deconstruct the rules around panels and having either 6 to a page or 3 to a page or a splash page or a dual splash page. And when you look at it, he seems to be doing a lot with the individual pages and how to break them up and how to think about them differently. There are some, like I'm looking like here, that have an obvious border that's in the background, but is meant to convey what's happening and to reflect what's happening. And then there's stuff in the background behind the panels that is used to help tell the story as well. And is that something that we see popularized after this, before this? Is this something that Neil Gaiman kind of pushed for?
This was happening a lot, I think, in popular comics. Maybe in the 1960s, you had a generation of creators start making books that were familiar with comic strips and comic books from their childhood. And so they knew the conventions of this medium. And this generation that came up are the ones who started to push at those boundaries and start to think about, the fact that you could change the panel shape and panel structure. It wasn't just a delivery system, but it could reflect the themes and the ideas that you're trying to convey simply by arranging these on a page. And I think especially one thing that is especially notable here is that, Neil Gaiman is very aware, and he said this, you have 6 panels per page. You can fit in about 30 words per panel. So he knew what the basic structure was, but he learned how to write comic books from Alan Moore, who is a comic book writer who really knew how to juxtapose words and image in a way to create this sort of poetic tension between the two. You know, he utilized irony a lot. He utilized sort of rhyming images, and he wrote these really full scripts. These were really long scripts that described every single aspect of each panel on each page in the story he was trying to tell, down to like how figures should be placed and what colors should be used and where they should be arranged in the panel. So he really brought this sort of auteurist vision to the writer's role, and Neil Gaiman sort of inherited that and continued in that tradition.
Sean, Alan Moore is quite prolific. What are the top maybe 3 comics that he is most associated with?
Alan Moore was a real trailblazer in terms of changing how comic book stories were told, in terms of breaking down barriers for UK creators to work on American comics, and he really just created several of the high watermarks in the medium. So Watchmen is probably his most famous work. It's been adapted to film, it's been adapted to television, it's stayed in print for over 30 years now. V for Vendetta is another important Alan Moore work, writing the Swamp Thing title for DC. A more recent one that has a really big and diverse audience, I would say a lot in the way that Sandman appeals to non-comic readers, appeals to, more women than a major publication in a superhero book normally would or is traditionally thought to have, is Promethea. Promethea also very concerned with the nature of storytelling and the imagination and things like that. So those are some of the works that Alan Moore has done.
Very cool.
The 2 that I had run into while I was learning about comics as a teenager were The Killing Joke, the Batman comic,
Yep.
The Killing Joke. We own that one. And I remember being absolutely horrified and being, this is not the Batman I grew up with. And then the one that I got immediately after that, From Hell, Jack the Ripper. Like, why? I have terrible luck. So I always associated Alan Moore with the most horrifying things you could read.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. He definitely deconstructed a lot of what we think about when it comes to who our superheroes are and what they're capable of.
Sean, you mentioned rhyming images. Could you go a little more into that? That's not a phrase that I've heard before.
Oh, well, it's not really necessarily an official term or anything like that, but it is something I think that happens frequently in Sandman in particular, and I can try to kind of point it out when it does. You'll notice that Neil Gaiman and the artists on the series will often use the layout of a panel, how figures are positioned, maybe the objects in it, to prompt us to think about an earlier moment in the series. So it'll be sort of a reflection of something that's happened previously, and it'll create this nonverbal resonance in the mind that will, reinforce a theme or highlight a particular moment's importance or something like that.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Do you fondly remember blowing the dust out of a golden Nintendo cartridge to get it to work?
Get the dust out of it.
All right, here we go. Yes, let's get it.
Now the screen's gray.
Aw, man. Or those long nights when you were up late fighting Ganon and you'd hear your mom coming downstairs.
Hello?
That's Mom. Pretend you're asleep.
Wait, pause it, turn off the TV.
Do you think she's gone?
Make a sound.
I thought I heard 2 boys down here. Oh well.
Well, Ben and Pat are here to transport you back to those exhilarating moments as the Hyrule Podcasters! Join the 2 brothers each week as they play through Zelda games in Nintendo's legendary series. Episodes are filled with color commentary, lightly researched facts, personal anecdotes, and more. Hyrule Podcasters is available through Anchor on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow the Hyrule Podcasters on Facebook and Instagram at Hyrule Podcasters and on Twitter at Hyrule Podcaster.
So with all that, Ashley, what was your favorite panel from issue 1?
Oh gosh, this was so hard to pick. There were so many great panels, and like Sean has said, he's breaking a lot of conventions. So it's okay, is this technically a panel? So one of my favorite And my volume doesn't have page numbers, so you'll have to bear with me. But it's right after the sort of title page where you have Sleep of the Just bordering the corner. You have Dream in the summoning circle, laying down, facing away from the cultists. And the reason I like this panel in particular, one, just the way the border is, it feels like it's kind of cradling him. Like he's this like infantile sort of creature that they've conjured. And the way his cloak is billowed, and you see it better on the page right before it, but the way they've drawn his cloak, you don't see the telltale flames that you'll see later. The texture of it, the way that it's drawn, it looks, and forgive me if this language makes people uncomfortable, it looks a little like afterbirth, like a placenta, the way he's being thrown in there, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and like the maroon coat around him and everything.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So, he's just been captured. His cloak is billowing out like this. He's in the fetal position. You see him at his most vulnerable. And he's encased in what we see later. It looks like this kind of glass egg. And you see throughout the series these drawings, these ink drawings of Dream sort of developing in an egg. So I feel like it harkens back to that a lot. And this like idea of, if I'm going to be sort of really insufferable, it feels like the birth of a dream.
I love it.
where it fits that egg motif. You see him in his most vulnerable, just the way it's spread out like that. I just find that really fascinating. You don't see him in this kind of positioning really at all, apart from these first few images and the fact that this is his introduction. You don't think, oh, protagonist, hero, the person you want to really be looking towards for anything. No, he's so lifeless in this moment that I find it to be a really compelling first introduction.
That's so great. I was so close to choosing that same image.
Were you really?
So I'm really happy that you picked it and you got to talk about it. I mean, I completely agree, and I think the sort of birth metaphor is absolutely deliberate.
And that was page 9 if you have the original set of comics and wanted to check that out.
Those sort of rounded, curved panels as he's imprisoned continue throughout the book. The shape, you could even say begins to change a little bit as Dream gets closer and closer to being released. I'm thinking of the page where Alex is walking down to this sort of crypt where Dream is imprisoned. That's a really lovely page. The top row, the first two panels, are him walking down. The middle row is him looking at Dream imprisoned. You see sort of a silhouette of Dream in shadow, and he's explaining that he wants power, immortality, and a promise that you won't seek revenge. And then beneath that sort of bottom rounded panel, you see Dream speak for the first time, where he says just no. And that sort of shape is almost like, to continue this metaphor you brought up, it's almost sort of moving through like a birth canal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or like a water droplet about to pop.
Yeah.
I think that's so great. And just to come back to that panel, the page that you mentioned, this is one example of Gaiman not breaking convention and keeping with it here, because the splash page, the title page is a wonderful tradition in comics. Jack Kirby, I think, did it in every comic he drew. Wherever the title page was, there's a big, exciting splash page to introduce you to the action. And then the funny sort of overturning here is that it's completely passive, right? It's this
Exactly.
thing just laying on the ground.
So even when he manages to still do the convention, he's still upending the convention.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And what's also interesting is that in this first issue, the Sandman, Morpheus, he is positioned as an antagonist to Burgress, who is our protagonist, who is driving, right? The Sandman drives no activity in this first issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's so weird. It's an issue of almost total passivity, right?
Yeah.
Because Dream is imprisoned. The other people we meet are victims of this sleepy sickness, right? So they're sort of, prisoners in their own way, being forced to stay awake or being forced to live entirely asleep. And then even Roderick and Alex are, stuck in a position of passivity in a way because they can't get what they want. They can't compel Dream to give them this power that they're looking for. Everyone is sort of frozen until that wonderful, moment of release where Dream finally goes through that portal he creates in that big panel, and it's like, the action kicks in for the first time.
Well, let me jump in then. That's page 30, and that's actually my panel that I had chosen. If we're going to keep this birth metaphor kind of moving forward, right? This is definitely the expulsion of Dream back into the dreaming, right? And so what we see is a pale white figure, outstretched, blue and black hair, and he has conjured some sort of teal blue sky cloud. There's these like little kind of almost faces in the bottom left. And really what it's trying to convey in my mind is that, Dream pulls his essence from the dreaming. And as he pulls back in there and as he is the one who creates nightmares, creates stories, creates the space for dreaming to be in, make sure that things work, it's on us and everything that dreams to then populate and participate in there. And right after this, you see how he will be using our dreams that he is a part of for the next 75 issues to fulfill his goals. And he is now the protagonist, right? He has shifted from antagonist of Roderick and Alex to now protagonist in our story. And that is very clearly defined in the way that Neil Gaiman decided to portray this panel along with his creative team.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. And that's something we really see. Like, we even see it later in the issue, right, where he's traveling through dreams and grabbing food and grabbing clothing from these sleeping dreamers. And that relationship between the king of dreams and the dreamers is one that's, it's always in tension throughout the series. And different members of Dream's family, of the Endless, have a different sense of, do they rule over these people who, have this quality that they personify, that they represent, or do they serve them, right? And Dream has a different answer, say, than a sibling like Desire.
Right.
But I love to see how that's visually represented, the way he's sort of shapes and empowered by Dreams, those like little faces in the corner there and everything, as you pointed out.
So let's slide into our last section, and that is the best non-Morpheus character from this issue. So you can never pick Morpheus. We could create more rules, like you can't pick the same character more than once, but that seems like a lot of things to remember who picked what, so we're not going to do that. So Ashley, I thought we could pitch over to you.
Sure.
So you get the first stab here. Favorite non-Morpheus character.
I can promise you mine is not going to come up again. Because my favorite non-Sandman character of this issue is Dr. John Hathaway. And so he doesn't come up for... Yeah, I know.
Guy.
I know. Well, that's part of... I felt like I had to show him some love. He's a tragic figure. Part of the reason why I picked him is because he very clearly cares for his son deeply. It's like the immediate impetus for why he's seeking Burgess out, someone like Burgess. He's very clearly a respected figure in his field. He's the curator of the Royal Museum. And so he's really not only putting his life, but his reputation on the line to try to save his son. And if you've ever met academics, sometimes they don't have the best relationships with their own kids. Frankly, I mean, if you just look at the culture of academia, Sean, I feel like you would know this, but
It's true.
You have to work so hard to get into your field that's a lot to risk. And so he clearly loves his son deeply, wants to get him back, steals from the Royal Museum to try to get him back with really he has to be at his wit's end because there's no real promise that this could work. So he's at the last sort of dredges of hope here. And once he realizes that there is not going to be any sort of resurrection for his own son, he tries to get back at Burgess and he tries to do right by the museum, but then ultimately is foiled one last time with his suicide note being burned. So I just for all of the things he tries to do well, for all the attempts at good that he puts forward, it's sadly an incredibly beautiful but ultimately tragic figure that I just don't think gets enough love. So I just want to shout out to Dr. John Hathaway for trying.
Sandman's greatest total failure, Dr. John Hathaway. I also thought, at that. I mean, I agree, and that's a really great point. And can you imagine like the horror of he's taking his own life and trying to make some amends at the end of this, and he's leaning over this table and dying and looking at this letter, his confession just burn in front of him.
Right, exactly, and then eventually when we do travel with Dream to hell, you do wonder as you're seeing all these different sections of hell, like what was his ultimate fate? We don't really see him again, I don't think. But there is that sort of like, shoot, I actually am really invested in this guy. He tried so hard. I hope he's not condemned in some way. I hope he got to be reunited with his son in the afterlife. So there's just a lot of like dreary sadness to it that of course I eat up.
Yes. The one thing that seemed odd to me about him is that very first panel on page 1 where his driver says, "Wake up, sir, we're here." And I know why Neil Gaiman had to do that,
Sure,
right?
of
You
course.
gotta start this Sandman story with "wake up." But dude's son just died, and he's like napping in the back of this car, going to sell his soul to this musician and doom his career. Like, I feel like I would be awake for that whole
I don't know.
ride.
I feel like everyone grieves differently. When I'm sad, I just take naps all the time. So maybe for him, he's just like, I gotta escape this on this bumpy carriage ride. I'm just going to like forcibly put myself into a meditative state until I fall asleep.
That is a good point.
I gotta be sharp to work with this occultist. He's not gonna get anything by me. I'm
ready.
an academic.
I'm ready to go.
Okay, I'm convinced. All right, I changed my mind.
I do wonder if he dreamed of anything while he was napping, though.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, Sean, favorite non-Morpheus character from issue 1?
Well, actually, so this is, I don't have a ton to say about him, but I've got to give props to the character who inspired the title of this issue, Sleep of the Just. I got to give it to Wesley Dodds, the original Sandman, who is maybe the least passive character in an issue of passivity, right? This was a character who it says the universe knows someone is missing and slowly attempts to replace him. Wesley Dodds' nightmares have stopped since he started going out at night, and he just puts evil people to sleep with his gas gun, and he wears this cool World War I style gas mask. And he's been a character who has a lot of history in DC Comics from 1939 to still being around today. And I mean, coming out of the success of Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, he had like a 70-issue long run in Sandman Mystery Theater. He shows up with prophetic dreams in Mark Waid and Alex Ross's Kingdom Come series from DC Comics. And he's just an all-around cool old guy, I think.
I agreed so much that was my original choice.
Oh, shoot. No wonder you had the page up already.
Sean, peek behind the curtain. Sean was looking through his version, and I just hand him my iPad so he could just read what he wants to read. All right, so my quick hit here is Colonel Sanders. So if you're unaware, when Dream is rapidly, after the expulsion scene, and he is rapidly trying to find food and clothing, he swings through this dream that is populated by all sorts of people. Elvis, the Duke, Marilyn Monroe. There's a person there in a clown mask, and then of all people, Colonel Sanders is there, and you just see Morpheus butt naked, reaching his whole hand. I mean, his entire arm past his elbow is into this bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Been there.
Who hasn't? And I just love that Colonel Sanders gets this shout out, and Crispy Kentucky Fried Chicken, sponsor us please, is in this comic.
Love that.
Yeah, that bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken looks suspect, though.
It's Dream Chicken.
It's Dream Chicken with feet.
Yeah, so even vegans can eat the Dream Chicken.
I just kind of love that Dream's like hand is kind of positioned over Colonel Sanders, though, like protective, like just excuse me, pardon me, I'm just gonna
Right.
like in case he falls forward, he can catch himself on his head.
Amazing. Well, that's the 6 sections. We got through all 6. How's everybody feeling?
Feeling good. Feeling good.
Any last thoughts before we sign off for the day?
Shout out to Sam Keith's work on those last couple pages with the nightmare of eternal waking that Dream condemns Alex to. I just remember being so horrified of that as a child. You know, Sam Keith always shines when he can do that really bizarre horror work. So I just love those couple of pages at the very end of the issue.
Ashley, you got a last honorable mention you want to throw out there?
Man, shoot. I have to piggyback off of what Sean said. The whole Sam Keith art style is really horrific to me,
Yes.
especially when he does anything that looks like melting. Teeth, ears, eyeballs, anything like that, it just immediately puts me on edge. Like the one panel that we have of Alex waking up from like his first nightmare when he turns and his friend's face just starts melting progressively and all that liquid is eking out. I remember reading it and covering my ears as if I was trying to keep my own liquid from spilling out because it's such a visceral panel. His work always inspires that like immediate physical reaction for me. Like I have to like hold the body part that he's drawn in such a like grotesque way that I just start like gripping myself. Like I have to ground myself right now. I'm okay. Like I'm not dreaming. I'm not going to start melting. It's fine. I'm fine. So just shout out to his capacity to draw liquids and flesh.
Yes, not something that gets called out enough in this world, right? Draw a great liquid.
No, exactly.
Amazing. Well, we hope that you enjoyed this first episode of the Sandman
Unlocked.
And remember, never trust the storyteller, only trust the story. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to the Sandman Unlocked, an Odd Conduit media production. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Sandman Unlocked. Join us on Discord as well. Thanks to our show producer, Patrick Childers, and to Lieutenant Headtrip for our theme and incidental music. If you'd like to support us directly, head over to our Patreon. You can follow Ashley on Twitter at DEEDEE_K and on Instagram and TikTok at Ashley Mowers. Find Sean on Twitter at Lon Dogson and find Headtrip everywhere at LT Headtrip. You can get all of this info and more in the show notes. Make sure to follow and subscribe and review us wherever you listen. Until next time, and remember, never trust the storyteller, only trust the story.